Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, episode 27A, an interview on the rise of Taft with Peri Arnold. I'm excited to welcome Peri Arnold to the show today. Peri is a professor emeritus in the Department of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame, a consultant to New York Times and Education, and author of several books, including Remaking the Presidency, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. Today, we're going to focus on the second of those three presidents, William Howard Taft, and his rise to the presidency. Peri, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure to be here, Kenny.
So listeners of my podcast are used to stories of lawyers becoming politicians. But Taft really seems to make that transition begrudgingly and relatively late in his career. Why was Taft so fascinated with the law?
You use the word fascinated. I would not use that word because I don't think Taft became fascinated and then went into the law. I think this was a natural development. His father was a lawyer. His father was a very political lawyer. He had served in Grant's cabinet. He was a minister to Russia, and prior to that, to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so he comes from a highly political family of lawyers. His older brother, Charles, was a lawyer. His, I think, younger brother, Henry, was also a lawyer in New York City, corporate lawyer. So to be a lawyer for Taft was simply in his genes. So it wasn't fascination that brought him there. But I think it was in the process of being a lawyer and being a judge in particular that Taft created a fascination. What you're identifying is a passion in him. And I think what it was a real love for the logic of the law, for the kind of answers one can get through deep research. Taft was not a Brandeis, who he hated, by the way, for reasons you probably know, because of Ballinger-Pinchot. He wasn't Frankfurter. He wasn't a great dissenter. He was a craftsman of the law, and that was work that he loved because it allowed, in my reading of him, it allowed him through hard and deep work and careful writing to solve problems. I think that was an exercise that he loved. And it was, I think, also an activity that he found rewarding because it was in some ways passive. At several points in his writing, letters, etc., he'd remark that he much preferred being behind the bench rather than arguing cases, because that meant you had to take sides. It was in a way it was too active. He loved being the decider when a problem was posed. So thus, I think he becomes fascinated by the law because it seems to address characteristics of his that are kind of deeply set in his personality.
So he gets into kind of the family business, and then he finds out, I actually love this. That's good.
Yeah, and remember, the family business is law and politics.
Yes.
So he loved also looking for the next position that politics would produce him. I mean, so there's that famous quote of his, to quote, like every well-trained Ohio man, I've always had my plate the right side up. And so he was a hungry political lawyer. I mean, the most of everything I've said and thought about Taft, still the most remarkable episode in his life, I think, is about 6-7 years after entering the bar, he decides that he is going to promote himself for appointment to the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yes.
Because an opening occurred at a time when positions in the court were not just party-based, but geographical as well. So an opening occurred that would properly be filled by an Ohio man, a Republican, of course. And Taft thought, why not me? Because I'm Alonzo's son.
Yeah.
I have a very well-connected father and a very well-connected brother, Charles. So count me in. He didn't get it, of course.
Right.
And he understood perfectly well why, because later he observed, I think in a letter to his father, that if I were president, I never would have appointed somebody like me. In a traditional party regime,
Yeah.
the jobs go to the loyalists.
Right.
He was a loyalist. Why not try?
Why not try? And really, that's the lesson everybody should probably take from Taft. Like, try. You never know. You might get lucky.
Exactly. And it kept working for Taft, one way or another.
Yeah. And so speaking of it, Taft, he would be a judge or a lawyer climbing up, this career ladder for basically the first 20 years of his career. Right. How does this experience shape his political style when he gets into politics later?
I think it severely, I think the answer to that is complex. My first answer is I think it severely limits him because it gave him a fairly narrow toolkit for dealing with the world. A toolkit that he was very good using, that is this kind of deep dives to solve problems. But by the same token, it gave him too little experience with the kinds of conflicts and controversies that a political actor has to resolve. Let me go back to that point that he himself made about preferring to be behind the bench. The advocate arguing in front of the bench is having to do something that in some sense is inherently political. Choose a side, make the best case for it. Taft didn't like that. He liked being given the problem, and then he could resolve it through a deep dive into a precedent and law. So I think the law in some ways crippled him, or his legal experience limited him rather than crippled him. Now, let's take a case where I think we can see his own mind is thinking of the law as strengthening him in ways that were misreading. As he was appointed to the Philippines, so McKinley asks him, will you go as a chairman of this commission, the civil commission, to take over government in the Philippines from the military command? His response was, my background is perfect. This is a job for a lawyer. Well, his background wasn't perfect. And it wasn't a job for a lawyer. It turns out he did a very good job there because he was a both smart and resourceful man. But the law was not the appropriate toolkit for the job he was taking on. But take it on, he did. And it was, after all, a better job than the one he had, he thought. And Nellie, his wife, loved the idea of going to the Philippines, so she pushed him to take it.
Okay, and I want to unpack like all these things you just talked about. These are like all the things we're going to talk about more in the next few questions. Let's start with, despite Taft constantly saying, and as you said, like he wanted to be a judge. That's what he liked to be. People kept seeming to push him toward political office. Most famously, his wife Nellie. What's your take on Nellie's impact on his career, both in pushing him toward politics and enabling and supporting him in politics?
Let me say two things in response. Yes. The first is Nellie, and then what I think is the more important characterization, the family.
Yes.
Nellie's a very ambitious woman. She's smart, and from the very beginning of their marriage, she had eyes on William Howard going the next step, and she was not so happy with their lives when he was in his judgeships, because she thought it was boring. In other words, in some ways, exactly what he loved, she thought was boring. That was being passive and doing deep dives in the law in places that were not as exciting as she thought she deserved to be, which was Washington in this case. Because when he his legal career gets him pretty quickly to the Solicitor General's role in Washington, and that was the kind of booby prize for wanting to be appointed to the Supreme Court.
Right.
So Harrison couldn't give him the Supreme Court, but he did think, oh, this would be a good guy for the Solicitor General's job. That's the federal advocate who argues in front of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
It's a job he held for less than a year because another judgeship opened up, and this was a rather distinguished one. It was a seat on the Sixth Circuit, Federal Appellate Court.
Yeah.
But of course, that took him back to Cincinnati. And so there's Nellie back in Cincinnati. And if Cincinnati's not the most exciting city at the moment, think about what it was in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
So that, and that was Nellie's problem. Here's Taft with a pretty distinguished judgeship to sit on the federal circuit.
Yeah.
But it wasn't enough. And so Nellie's always there, wanting to push Taft towards the next job that could fall onto his plate. So
right.
But having said that, I think that we overestimate Nellie's importance because there are others involved in this. There's a family enterprise. I've never studied a major political figure who was more dependent on a set of intimate actors than Taft was. Taft has this very strong relationship with his parents and then with his siblings, such that every major decision he makes called for a corporate meeting of all of the family.
Yeah.
And the question was, should William Howard do this or that? Including, on one occasion at least, when he was in the Philippines, and Roosevelt become president. McKinley was assassinated and offered him the Supreme Court. And that called for a family conference in New York, sending representatives to see Roosevelt, to see what Roosevelt really intended. And Taft was bitterly frightened that Roosevelt wanted to get rid of Taft from the Philippines. In other words, he felt uncertain about where he was. And so the family enterprise had to go and solve that problem for him. And they suggested he turn down the offer, the Supreme Court. Yeah. And so there's this larger set of actors who are influencing Taft, not just an ambitious wife.
Yeah.
It's a hell of an ambitious family.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Thank you for giving that context. And we mentioned the Philippines a couple times now. Let's dive more into that. Taft will finally leave this life of law when President McKinley convinces him to join a civilian commission in charge of the Philippines.
And Nellie says, let's do it.
Right. Right. And how does McKinley land on Taft, though? Like, what makes McKinley say this judge over in Cincinnati, who, as you say, like, Taft thought he had the perfect toolkit, but he really didn't, but what made McKinley think he did?
Why would you pull Taft out of the hat? I think that's a very good question. And the best way to answer it would be, if it exists, to be into McKinley's correspondence.
Right.
However, not being in McKinley's correspondence, I think the best answer is the family enterprise, because McKinley was being heavily lobbied by Charles Taft, by Henry Taft, both of whom were powerfully influential. Charles was a major publisher and a major Republican in Cincinnati. Henry being a major corporate lawyer in New York, and heavily influenced and powerful Republicans, to appoint Taft to the cabinet. And so as McKinley enters the presidency, thus Taft is on McKinley's horizon.
Got it. Yeah.
Figure.
Yeah.
Well, he didn't get appointed to the cabinet, but then there's this position potentially way out there in the Philippines. You got to give, these are powerful figures. You got to give the Taft something. Send William Howard to Manila. And so more or less, that's how he gets to Manila. I mean, it's not as if McKinley had assessed Taft as having one specific set of skills, like he can speak Tagalog.
Right.
So he's the man to go to Manila. It's just that it fell out of the sky and Taft's plate was facing the right side up.
So when Taft arrives in the Philippines, he arrives like in the middle of this pretty brutal Philippine-American war, this brutal guerrilla war.
Being led by brutal American military.
Yes.
It was awful.
So what's expected of Taft in the circumstance? I mean, they drop him in saying, okay, you're the civilian commission, soon a civilian governor, but it is very much a military operation out there.
Yeah. And I think I just think one of the best stories, both about Taft, but also about the building of the American empire in the late 19th and early 20th century, because it's clearly an imperial story. It's a story of colonialism, but it's a story also of attempting to bring some order and decency into a colonial situation. Taft goes to the commission goes to the Philippines with marching orders from the Secretary of War, Elihu Taft, to create a government, to create a situation which would be at least palatable for the Filipino elite and upper middle class, to kind of bring a kind of decency to American governance of the Philippines. So essentially, Taft and the commission are sent, go do good, go do something decent out there. And Taft takes the bull by the horns. I think his accomplishments in the Philippines they're quite remarkable. And he loved doing it, and his wife loved doing it. And I think what he showed in the Philippines was a set of possibilities that had not yet been expressed in his legal career. First of all, he loved the kind of going public part of this, meaning he loved going out and pressing the flesh. And Nellie loved going out and pressing the flesh. So they would go out to villages and they would meet local leaders. And Nellie was out there meeting and people and shaking hands. And one of the things I discovered was that horrified the American military, because these were a lower class. These were inferior people, and there was a really strong racism.
Yes, the American people feeling that toward the Filipinos.
Yeah, and Taft and his wife lacked that. I mean, there was a real decency in the Tafts, and so they went a long way towards creating a kind of goodwill amongst well-placed Filipinos towards the Americans. And they also, they just loved being in this imperial situation. They loved living in a palace. They loved having this kind of command over a little empire of theirs. There was no check and balances.
Right.
Taft was the sovereign. And
it's good to be king.
Yeah, and he had the political skills, it turned out, to use the War Department, to use Elihu Taft to circumvent the military commanders, General MacArthur.
Wait. Who is the secretary? You said, is it Elihu Root or Elihu Taft?
I'm sorry, Elihu Root.
Yeah, thanks.
He's the Secretary of War.
Yes.
And General MacArthur is the military commander of the Philippines, who was a pretty clumsy guy. This is the father.
Right, I know. We're going to get to know his son soon, and oh goodness.
Yes. And so Taft, Taft is very successful in this role, and all the evidence is that he just loves it, and Nellie loves it. However, it wasn't great for his health. Here's this overweight, relatively unfit man who is having to suffer with all the kind of maladies that are around in a tropical setting.
Sure.
At a time well before antibiotics. And he's constantly fighting himself with stomach problems, with infections. And so down the road, the story of how he then gets from the Philippines back to Washington itself is complex, because he didn't really want to go. I mean, he just loved being in the Philippines. But it wound up, I think, being costly for him to be there in terms of his personal health. And then there's the case. Then there's that kind of, what to call it, the kind of little worm gnawing at him that was his ambition. This was a very ambitious man, And so it wasn't just the plate turned up for the next job that would fall, it's the next great job. And the family enterprise, his family advisors were strongly pushing him towards a next step beyond the Philippines that would be an executive position, not the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court was offered twice while he was in this kind of in the Philippines and then transitioned back to Washington to become Secretary of War to Roosevelt. But in both times he refused it. And of course he loved being a judge. But I think we have a kind of cartoonish view of Taft.
Absolutely. He's the hot tub president. I'm not the hot tub, the bathtub president.
Yeah, he was. So this cartoon is he wanted to be a judge, but somebody made him not be a judge.
Right.
Which is a foolish view of him.
Right.
This is a very ambitious man who loved being successful and who thought he deserved to be successful and who's kind of rooted in the family genotype is from his father. His father talked about his sons becoming men of excellent careers and great accomplishment.
Yeah.
And so that kind of projection onto him is a powerful force. And of course, his family advisors keep reinforcing that.
Yeah.
So when it turns out he proves himself in Roosevelt's eyes, Theodore Roosevelt, president, to be very competent as the governor of the Philippines. And of course, they go back a long way because they had become friends in the early 1880s, the middle 1880s, when Taft was Solicitor General. Roosevelt had come to Washington to head the first Civil Service Commission. And so they were relatively young, kind of somewhat higher than mid-level bureaucrats. And they fell in with each other. And they had a kind of set of mutual connections that brought them together. And so Roosevelt admired Taft looking back at that period. And so his success in the Philippines brought him, in Roosevelt's eyes, to be a logical successor to Elihu Root when Root resigns as Secretary of the War. So he calls Taft to Washington. Taft consulted the family, and which was encouraging him to continue on this rise in executive positions with an eye possibly in the presidency rather than the Supreme Court. And Taft says yes to Roosevelt, winds up as Secretary of War, which was in fact only a paper position. Never really Secretary of War.
Yeah. So before I get to Secretary of War, there is one question I want to ask about the Philippines before we kind of leave that behind. And that's I've read and seen two takes on Taft as civilian governor of the Philippines. I feel like I know where your answer is going to lean, but I'd still love to hear it. And the two takes is that Taft was either a benevolent ruler who fought to remove barbaric American generals and improve the life of Filipinos, or he was just another kind of racist, paternalistic American who set up an oligarchy for American businesses to exploit. What's your take? Like, are both true? Is one wrong?
That's the cartoon. But that's a cartoon. Because there are elements of both in Taft. Taft is clearly an imperial governor, and he would no more recommend independence for the Philippines circa 1902, 1901, than he would have thought that he could fly. These were little brown people, and he used that phrase,
yes,
who deserved to be cared for and deserved self-government someday, and should be nurtured toward that end. So among his accomplishments in the Philippines is to create a robust and effective educational system, to do much better than the Spanish had done, to get rid of the corrupt Catholic church structure of the Philippines. So this whole list of real accomplishments that were benevolent, that were good for the Philippines. He also fought to create economic opportunity by increasing trade between the Philippines and the United States, which would require changes in the American tax structure, tariff structure. He worked at all of that, but all of that was within the context of an American imperial structure with colonialism. So both are at work. But was Taft, how to put this, was Taft a decent governor and a decent man? Yes. I mean, I think boldly so. This is a good man.
Good. Awesome. Thank you for that context there. And so, as you mentioned, Taft, he comes back to the United States when Teddy Roosevelt invites him to be a Secretary of War, but he's not really like a Secretary of War as we kind of think of it. What's he really up to during his time in TR's cabinet, and how's it influence him?
This struck me as really interesting because it was a way also of looking into Theodore Roosevelt's mind. John Hay, Roosevelt's Secretary of State, was becoming sicker. So he really lost the Secretary of State. At the same time, Elihu Root had been arguably the most effective Secretary of War we'd ever had, who had modernized the Department of War, had created the first general staff structure. So Taft inherited an extremely well-organized Department of War. It didn't really need an immediate excellent manager, but Roosevelt needed a Secretary of State.
Yeah.
And so the kind of jobs, the kind of assignments that would have fallen on Hay if he had been capable of performing went to Taft, because Roosevelt trusted Taft so much. And that's an important part of the story, both for Roosevelt and for Taft. He had really won a great deal of admiration from Roosevelt. So the initiation of the Panama Canal Project falls into Taft's lap. Did he know anything about civil engineering? Not a thing.
Right.
Was this a job for a lawyer? Of course not. But he was sent to Panama to begin to organize the project, which he did effectively. When a civil war threatened to break out in Cuba, of course, is ostensibly an independent country at that point, under
Yes.
American suzerainty, Taft is sent to resolve the issue. He did, spending a fairly long time in Cuba. And so he becomes Roosevelt's important messenger to the world, essentially a substitute Secretary of State.
Yeah.
From Taft's perspective, and from the perspective of Taft's family, this is wonderful because it reinforces that path towards the presidency, in that it's demonstrating Taft's fitness for the presidency.
In 1909, he becomes the president. He gets it with TR support. He becomes the president. And now I've covered his breaking with Taft, TR's breaking with Taft in a previous episode. So we don't have to go into Bollinger Pichot and the cause of their falling out. But what does losing TR support mean for Taft's administration? Because Taft's going to go in, he's president, TR's traveling the world. Then they have this big falling out. What impact does that have on Taft as president?
It's a really interesting question. And I think that there are several different related answers to that. But I want to start in a somewhat bigger scope. And that larger scope is that entering the presidency, Taft enters the first job of his career for which there was no recipe. There was no structure.
Huh.
He went to the Philippines. That was the biggest challenge of his career at that point. But he went with a detailed plan of action that Elihu Root had created.
Oh, okay.
Go structure a government, and it's going to look like X, Y, and Z. Go do this. Not that everything Taft did in the Philippines was by that recipe. Right. He had a real feel for the people part of the assignment, the reaching out to Filipinos. But the structure of the job was a given to him. He entered the presidency, and for the first time, I envision this. He walks into the White House, goes into the presidential office for the first time. There's now an Oval Office, by the way. It had just been created. So he goes into the Oval Office and opens the drawers. Where's the recipe? Where's the job description? There is none.
Yeah.
he's left in the situation where there's Roosevelt. He had vocally, publicly, and privately said, "I am an extension of Roosevelt. That's my job. That's my job description.
Got it. Yeah.
To break with Roosevelt is to break with the only job description he had.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
promised to further Roosevelt's progressive presidency."
Yeah. When
that relationship was shattered, then where's the compass? What's Taft to do? He was caught, and this is not just a problem of Taft personally. This is a characteristic of a chronological period. We're looking at a period in which it's the ending of the period of party dominance that struck the dominance of party in the American political structure, the beginning of a more public, more pluralistic kind of politics. Both Roosevelt and Wilson, who bracket Taft, were very different from Taft and were responding to those winds of change, including, to some extent, breaking or redirecting their parties. Taft is a product of that older party structure. And so he's caught in this tension between that older role of party, in which presidents are essentially dominated by party, as McKinley had Harrison had been, and the promise to Roosevelt that I am going to be progressive. And that's irresolvable. Taft couldn't figure a way out of that. And so he was stuck as Roosevelt breaks with him, as he breaks with Roosevelt. It was very painful personally to him, pitifully painful, which is, just a side comment on that. All the presidents that I've studied and know of, if I had a choose who to have as a friend or drink beer with, it would be William Howard Taft, because he's an essentially decent man, a personable, interested in other people, not just interested in talking at people.
Yeah.
So this is so in many ways he's a really fine human being, but he needed, and he was hurt by this. This was one of his closest relationships, and Roosevelt was publicly attacking him, and Roosevelt's supporters were now breaking with him, so that he was losing his polar star in the presidency. So what should be his agenda? What should guide him? And he lost that. Now, I want to quickly add one thing. He had an agenda. That is, he did a lot of things in the presidency. And you can look back at his presidency and see it was pretty successful. There are things he did that no president had ever tried before. One of the thing that I like best, it's not the most important thing he did, but it's pretty important, is Postal Savings Bank. The Postal Savings Bank was a place for little Americans to go put their money in a safe place. In other words, the post office. You go to the post office and you could create a deposit account.
Really?
What that did, and it passed Congress.
Yeah.
Put into effect, and it solved a huge problem for Americans, which is you can't trust banks. Federal deposit insurance.
Yeah.
In 1907, we'd had a really significant economic crisis, a crash, in which banks crashed. Little folks lost their money. There were people standing in long lines at banks. Taft had a solution, the Postal Savings Bank, because it wasn't going to crash. Your money was safe. And in a way, the theater of Franklin Roosevelt's 1933 federal savings deposit insurance was the next bigger solution to it. And so there's lots of things in the Taft presidency that we could count on as real accomplishments and progressive. But the larger problem here is that the overall story, the headline story, is one of the Taft presidency crashing because it's losing support. Just because the Roosevelt progressives turned away, that is, the Republican progressives turned away, and he was too clumsy to keep the support of fully of conservative Republicans, because he was try to do things like the postal savings.
Right. That's kind of one of the things that surprised me most about reading about Taft. And maybe it's because, like, if there's the first thing you know about Taft, it's he had this breaking with Roosevelt, and Roosevelt's really progressive. So I was expecting a more conservative guy, but he's really trying to do a lot of progressive things. And as you know, like postal savings, he gets the wheels in motion for income tax. He is conservation. Yeah. He was a lot more progressive than I expected. Can you elaborate? You said he was a successful president. Elaborate on how successful of a president was he? What made him a successful president?
So, what is a successful president? I mean,
good question.
Ultimately, a success in the presidency, I want to argue, is not the list of accomplishments. From a long distance away, we could look back at Taft, for example, and say, hey, he was pretty successful. Look at the list.
Yeah.
But we can move a president's success is his ability, or ultimately her ability, to match the demands of the moment for leadership. Think no better example than Franklin Roosevelt. But then again, Taft is bookended by two presidents who fulfill that recipe. Roosevelt and Wilson, and he doesn't. He winds up creating conflict, increasing conflict within the political system. Progressives breaking with him, and then conservatives trying to push back against initiatives, which we would both agree look pretty progressive. More antitrust action than under Roosevelt. He also strengthens the federal government's capacity for regulatory action against corporations. He strengthens the Interstate Commerce Commission, something that, in fact, he had also done in rulings as an appellate court judge. And so a fair amount of success in that respect, but failure to gain political support, which is in the presidency, suicide.
Paramount, yeah.
Because you lose.
Yes, yeah. So a question that's kind of a natural outgrowth of that, and this comes from a listener, and I'd love to run it by you. It's a two-parter. Did Taft signal the end of progressive Republicans and the GOP, and did he abandon civil rights?
I think those are two different things.
They are kind of two different things.
I think of civil rights first.
Sure.
The Republican Party abandoned civil rights in 1876 when it made the deal with the Democrats to put Hayes in the presidency.
Mm-hmm.
The deal was to end Reconstruction in the South.
So anything after that, right?
There's no. I mean, think about the the Republican-dominated Supreme Court after that ruled against the Civil Rights Act. I mean, there's the wonderful role of John Marshall Harlan as a dissenter, trying to call attention to the 14th Amendment, that civil rights was dead. And the Republican Party was interested only in the lonely Black delegates in the South who were Republicans who come up to the convention and provide essentially machine Republican politics for the party. And the Republican Party was appointing some Blacks to low-level postmaster jobs in the South. But civil rights was dead for the party. But progressivism, that is economic progressivism, social progressivism, apart from civil rights, that didn't die with Taft, but it was transfigured because I think it's a mistake not to see later figures like Herbert Hoover,
yeah,
as as carrying some of that strain in his political style and political ambitions. And so I think with Taft, the progressive strain in the Republican Party begins to, like the COVID virus, go through a kind of genetic reformation.
Way to make a topical analogy.
Sure, you gotta always do that.
All right, so that's it didn't end progressive. You're right. Like Hoover's kind of a weird character. I'm reading about him right now. He's a very interesting, like, in between guy. Okay, so wrapping up Taft, he is ultimately defeated after one term, as you mentioned, in a large part because of this fracture with TR and Roosevelt running as a third-party candidate and taking the progressives out of the Republican Party.
Almost wholly for that reason.
Yes,
I would love to see a kind of, which we really can't do, a kind of alternative history, which we try to rerun that election without Roosevelt.
That would, would the Democrats ever get back in the White House without giving Wilson that shot?
So, but Wilson gets in, Taft loses, he's embittered by it. He slinks off with his tail between his legs because he doesn't handle rejection very well.
I mean, that's hard. Who does? It's hard.
Right. And it's part of his being a sweet guy.
Yeah.
And his father, in a way, to put it too simply, his father, Alphonse, would have really been disappointed at Taft's loss. And so he takes away, and in fact, he's going to go back to the law.
He will, and as you mentioned, actually, my next episode is going to be an interview all about his law career. He's going to have the second act in the Supreme Court.
Yeah, a successful act.
So if you look, though, like we focus on his rise and his presidency, what legacy do you think he leaves behind from that time?
Looking at only at his presidency, I think his legacy is undeservedly small. In other words, I think he was a more successful president in some kind of objective way within his own context than we have given him credit for. And that's because in that larger sense, he was a misfit in the historical forces at work at that point. Now, having said that, I think there really is a concrete legacy that does go on, and Taft is an administrator. Taft, one of the things Taft did, I think, without being all that heralded, is he took the administrative dimension of the presidency seriously. He created a commission of heavy-hitting administrative experts to recommend significant changes in the executive branch, including, and Taft really took the bull by the horns on the power of the president over federal budgeting. There was no budget yet. There was no budget power yet. And Taft tried to push to create, by the way, without there being a legal basis for it, in effect, the presidential budget. And so these are important developments, and they go on to influence Wilson and later presidents in this kind of history of administrative reform and reorganization in the presidency. That's an issue I wrote about in my first book called Making the Managerial Presidency. Advertisement.
So everybody go buy it.
Yeah, sure.
Last question I got for you. What lessons in leadership do you think we can learn from President Taft?
Gee, this is saccharine, but I think there's a real lesson of decency in Taft. The presidency doesn't. Those who become presidents don't have to be twisted. I'm thinking of an observation of the great historian Gary Wills about the presidency. Essentially, what kind of normal human being gets up in the morning, looks in the mirror, and says, "Oh, America needs you"? Who's crazy enough to seek an office in which the odds of winning it are huge? It's like buying a lottery ticket.
Right.
So the people who wind up in the presidency are often pretty twisted human beings. William Howard Taft is, I think, a whole and sound human being. And that's a quality the presidency needs. But Joe Biden may be a reflection of that too, of just what decency does bring to leadership. But there's also a negative lesson here, and it is come to the presidency with more political experience than William Howard Taft. Win a few elections before you run for the presidency again, and have a good nose and good ears for the presidential wins and for political wins and smells.
If you'd like to hear more from Peri, please check out Remaking the Presidency, Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. Thank you so much for your time, Peri. This was fun.
Hey, fun, Kenny. Thanks for asking me on. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends about the show, and leave a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. It's always good to hear from y'all. You can also follow the show on Facebook at Abridged Presidential Histories or on Twitter at APH Podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. It helps me buy books and pay to host the show, and thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, we'll look at what Taft got to after the presidency, his time as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the legal legacy he left behind. That's next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.